Hey guys, welcome to CraterMania. I'm your host, the man they call Crater, and I'd like to welcome you all back to my 500 Movies in 2025 series. For this episode, this will be movies number 209 through 212. And so this has been an interesting week. I guess we should start off from this past Monday. I did the Memorial Day special on Starship Troopers. If you guys haven't watched it yet, it's on the channel, so you guys go check that out anytime you like. Um, and not only was Monday Memorial Day, but it was also Peter Cushing's birthday. And on Tuesday, the 27th, was Vincent Price and Christopher Lee's birthday. So I was supposed to have done this stream actually yesterday, but just some things came up. Said it's been an interesting week. Um, and so I decided to do this tonight. And first of all, I want to say I hope you guys are having a wonderful Friday. I hope you guys have a wonderful weekend. Um, I know me and my family got some things planned ahead for tomorrow. Um, but anyway, back to what I was saying. Um, yeah, so I was supposed to have done this stream last night, and just some things came up, but yeah, so this is my a new sub series, I guess you could call it, that I was going to be doing, called the Masters of Macabre. And I thought, with this being the week of the birthdays of Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing and Vincent Price, to just watch some movies that those guys were a part of, where they were in the movies together, that we could kind of talk about this week. And this will be part one. So part two will be I'm gonna be talking about 5 more movies on Sunday night. But for tonight, I'm gonna be talking about 4 different movies. And before I get into those, just want to say that I decided to start this series with these guys because these guys are absolute legends when it comes to classic horror. And I'm such a huge fan of all 3 of these guys, especially Vincent Price. Vincent Price is like my horror movie hero. He's when it comes to anyone involved with horror films, he's like the number one guy for me. And just always just really enjoyed his charisma, just the way that he performs on screen. Um, you know, and just everything that he's been connected to, you know, in the media, whether it be movies or it be music, where he worked with Michael Jackson, he worked with Alice Cooper, um, just everything. He's just a very unique personality in history, I feel, and just such a huge fan. And I feel that same way, about Christopher Lee, because Christopher Lee, his career goes outside of horror as well. Same with Peter Cushing. Christopher Lee. He was also Saruman in the Lord of the Rings trilogy, which is my favorite trilogy of all time. You got Peter Cushing, who's a part of another huge movie trilogy outside of horror, and where he played Grand Moff Tarkin in Star Wars. So, just all 3 of these guys have had very illustrious careers, and just love them all 3 in their own different ways. And hopefully one day I'll do just like, aside from like movie reviews and stuff, I'll just do kind of like a collective discussion, I guess, about those 3 guys, and just all their contributions to not only horror but just to pop culture in general. Um, but yeah, like I said, before I get into talk about the movies, and I just want to talk a little bit more about my week. So unfortunately, I found out a few days ago that my Aunt Laureen, she passed away after a long battle with cancer, and that was my mother's sister, and I grew up being very close to her, and and her husband Danny, and their two kids, Lori and Jeremy. Just we were all very close, and um, yeah, it just we were kind of expecting it, to be honest, for a while, but just when you get that news, it's never easy to take, especially if you're close to people like that, and yeah, so um, I just wanted to bring that up and just let everybody in my family that's watching this, my aunt Lorraine up in heaven, you know, I love you, I miss you, and it's not going to be easy not seeing you again. But one day, but maybe one day, Um, but and then other than that, just some very interesting things happening at my work that I can't really get into. But yeah, so it's this week has definitely been interesting. Um, but aside from all that, let's get into tonight's show. Been excited about doing this one for a long time now. The whole Masters of Macabre, and hopefully I can continue this sub series later on down the road with some other horror movie personalities. Um, but this one is definitely going to be a fun one tonight. And then part two on Sunday, going to be super fun as well. Um, so let me go ahead and start this off by talking about the first movie that I watched this week for this particular show. Um, and this was Amicus Productions, which is, the British horror counterpart basically to Hammer Films. And Amicus Productions were mainly known for their anthology movies. And this first movie I'm going to be talking about is one of those. And this is a fantastic one too. Like, and this was one um, that I had actually never watched before, and I was really surprised by this one and how much I loved it. And this is Doctor Terror's House of Horrors from 1965. Now, this is the kind of film that really truly satisfies the soul, of that horror, that classic horror fan. Particularly one like myself, who holds the talents of like Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee, who are both in this one together. I hold those guys' talents in like the highest possible esteem that you can imagine. And said this is an Amicus production, and um, it was the studio's groundbreaking first, you know, attempt into feature horror, and its whole, pioneering anthology structure, and it's just an absolute delight from start to finish. And because you got this whole platter of scares, that anchored by the sheer presence of these two titans of terror, Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing. So, and you can just never mind the lavish budgets or excessive gore of modern horror. What Doctor Terror's House of Horrors offers is atmosphere, clever concepts, and most importantly, just the chance to see Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee at work in their prime. Um, and it just and they're adding kind of this dread to every frame that they inhabit in the film. Um, and you know, Peter Cushing masterfully sets the stage from the moment this film begins. So the film immediately grabs you with this kind of this very ingenious, framing device. There's five strangers on a train, and their journey on this train are joined by this mysterious Dr. Shrek, who is portrayed with charm by Peter Cushing. And Peter Cushing, bless his heart, he has this unique ability to just kind of imbue even the most eccentric characters with this quiet intensity and intelligence. And as Dr. Shrek, which funny enough, the name Shrek translates to terror in German, and thus Dr. Terror's House of Horrors. And he's not any kind of like typical villain, but he's rather this kind of calm, almost sympathetic figure who holds these kind of ancient secrets, that where his eyes kind of hold these ancient secrets that you're not really sure what to think of him when you first see him. So he presents to everyone else in the train cart his tarot deck, which he also calls his House of Horrors. So Dr. Terror's House of Horrors is a tarot deck, um, not an actual house. But as kind of a mere curiosity, you know, Cushing's kind of subtle performance, lets you know that there's something far more significant and and far more terrifying at play here with this tarot deck. And he I think he expertly sets the mood, for each tale in this anthology film. And all of his introductions are kind of laced with this kind of the inevitable. You know what I mean? So he's in this. He is the glue. He's the narrator, the ringmaster that's guiding us through the darkness, and his performance just really elevates the entire enterprise here. Seeing him in this role alone is definitely worth watching this. I think for any fan of his career, of his films. Um, and then, while Cushing, anchors the whole film, Christopher Lee gets, I think, arguably the most memorable segment all to himself in the disembodied hand. Um, but we'll get to that one. So first, I want to just cover um, the other stories here, and it's just before I get into those, one of the great things about this film, and just in the the subsequent Amicus production anthologies, that would follow, is just the variety of the stories that are being told. Not every story hits the same note, but I think that's part of the fun. Even Creepshow, which is my favorite anthology film of all time, is like that. Like not every one of those stories in Creepshow hits the same exact note, but that's part of it. That's part of why it's all so enjoyable. Um, but before I get to the disembodied hand, um, the with Christopher Lee, let's talk about these other stories. So the first story that is told in this film, which is the werewolf story, it kind of kicks things off with that classic gothic atmosphere. Just featuring these old family curses and Scottish Isles. And while Cushing and Lee aren't in this particular story, it establishes the film's willingness to delve into traditional horror themes under Freddie Francis's direction. Um, and Freddie Francis is the director of this film, by the way. So And then the next story, which is the creeping vine, which is a really cool one. I love this one. It's a very fun, slightly pulpy entry about hostile nature that feels unique and unsettling in its own way. Um, and a good example of the anthology format is trying different kinds of scares. Um, and then another one of the stories in this is called Voodoo, and it's for me personally, I think this is perhaps the weakest link when it comes to all of these stories um, in Doctor Terror's House of Horrors. Um, it's notable for its kind of its jazz music focus and Roy Castle's performance. It just to me it just feels a little out of place compared to the others. But again, like I said, that's the whole fun of it. It still provides a kind of different flavor, a supernatural threat. But the one I really wanted to talk about, well, no, I almost left one out. So there is another one and a story in this called Vampire. And funny enough, this story also lacks Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee, who are known for the Hammer films, Dracula films. Um, But it does feature an early role for Donald Sutherland, and it just kind of builds this very nice sense of paranoia with this twist ending, so it shows that Amicus Productions wasn't afraid, to play with expectations. Um, but going back to the one I really wanted to talk about here because it does involve one of the people that this show is about, and that's Christopher Lee. And like I said, that one was called The Disembodied Hand. Um, so, like I said, while Peter Cushing, he anchors the whole film, Christopher Lee in this segment of the film is it's arguably the most memorable, to me at least. And and he's magnificent in this. He plays this guy named Franklin Marsh, who is this very pompous, cruel, utterly insufferable art critic whose whose devastating wit is just only matched by his arrogance. And Christopher Lee just absolutely sinks his teeth into this character. You love to hate this character of Franklin Marsh, just from the moment he appears. Even in the train and the epilogue or I'm sorry, the prologue with when they're in the train car, and just like you could just tell this guy's an asshole, uh, and because he's delivering these very scathing critiques and he's kind of basking in his own self importance. And Christopher Lee's that his you know normally known for this his kind of command of dialogue and just his ability to convey in this character, especially that kind of that malice beneath this kind of sophistication, and it's all on full display here. And when his character Franklin Marsh's cruelty leads to these kind of tragic consequences for this artist Eric Landor, um, and the whole supernatural vengeance that follows that is is really all the more satisfying because Christopher Lee makes Marsh's torment so believable. Just watching Christopher Lee's character descend into this paranoid terror, which is haunted by this relentless severed hand, is to me just really a masterclass in portraying psychological breakdown mixed with just that sheer desperate fear. And for me, this segment is a standout purely just for the opportunity to see Christopher Lee kind of chew the scenery and and then be absolutely terrified by this unstoppable force, which is just this disembodied hand. Um, But it's quintessential Christopher Lee. He's powerful, commanding, just utterly convincing, whether he's the villain or he's the victim. Um, and yeah, I mean, so it's that's definitely to me. I mean, just the most standout when it comes, because and I may be biased when it came to that. I don't know, guys, but I really enjoy that one. I really enjoy Christopher Lee's performance. Um, but even in the segments that I talked about before, that doesn't feature Peter Cushing or Christopher Lee. Um, the entire film really maintains this kind of certain atmosphere, and excuse me, this kind of certain atmosphere, and just this sense of unease, you know, uh, cultivated by Freddie Francis's direction. And Freddie Francis, while perhaps not as a visually flamboyant as Terrence Fisher, was this master, I think, of creating mood and tension within confined spaces, which is, I think, was perfect, for these stories that are being told here. Um, and Dr. Terror's House of Horrors is historically significant, because it wasn't just Amicus Productions' first horror film. It just kicked off their successful run of all these anthology movies, including Torture Garden, Tales from the Crypt, Asylum, etc. Um, and it really established a formula, a framing device, multiple distinct horror stories that became this trademark for Amicus, and just this beloved subgenre of British horror cinema. And its influence can be seen in many other anthology films and TV shows. It proved that there was this appetite for horror that was told in short stories. These sharp bursts, often with twist endings, and just a focus on psychological or supernatural stuff like that. Um, and I would definitely recommend this to any Peter Cushing or Christopher Lee fan. Uh, it's it's just to me, it's unmissable. Like I said, even though the voodoo story is the weakest link, it's like I said, it's a part of that charm, though. It's a part of the fun when it comes to these anthology films. How just not everything is going to land on one particular note, but like I said, that's part of it. And I think any anthology fan out there would understand that. But this movie offers Peter Cushing in just a central role here as Dr. Shrek or Dr. Terror. And I think that role is one of his more kind of subtle but very effective creepy performances. And then you got Christopher Lee, in his role as well. As Franklin Marsh. It's just that pure villainy, that you expect when it comes to Christopher Lee. Just in the atmosphere and quality that you associate with their best British horror work, even from a studio, often seen as as Hammer's rival. It has that distinctive gothic, um, slightly, I guess, theatrical feel common to the era. Um, and it was just a foundational film, in that whole Amicus legacy, as I've stated before, and just this is and it's just within that studio that where both of those actors would appear again. And while they don't share the screen in a story segment or anything, other than just the kind of wraparound, um, which is definitely, I think, is a missed opportunity, to not have them kind of featured together in one. But in the end, and everything, and how the movie ends, you kind of can understand why. Um, but just their presence, that does exist in the wraparound. I think it's what really elevates everything significantly. If you watch the film all the way through and kind of understand the ending of it all. Um, Peter Cushing, he's like the bookends of this film. He's the one that is kind of like brought all these guys together into and letting them know what their fates hold um, according to the tarot cards. And he just does all of this, with this kind of very unsettling, calm, and Christopher Lee, he just delivers that specific, unforgettable dose of um, just that driven horror, that we've come to expect from him. But I guess in conclusion, just to wrap this up, Doctor Terror's House of Horrors is, to me, is a cherished classic. Um, it's not just important for like laying the groundwork for Amicus and their success, but it's a genuinely entertaining collection of these horror stories. And most importantly, it features two of the greatest names in genre cinema history. Just delivering this kind of intelligent, these compelling performances that just made us fall in love with them, in the first place. So if you cherish their work, uh, and you've never seen Dr. Terror's House of Horrors, it's an absolute pleasure. I highly, highly recommend this film. Like I said, I was new to this film this when I watched this week, but this is definitely one that I will be watching more and more throughout my life. Um, Now, moving on to the next film. So, as you, as I said earlier, um, I'm not just talking about Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee, but I'm also talking about my favorite person when it comes to horror uh, that there's ever been, that there ever will be, and that's Vincent Price. So, in this next film, this is the Oblong Box from 1969, and this one actually does not feature Peter Cushing, but this also does feature Christopher Lee. And as just a devoted fan, of these grandmasters of horror, Vincent Price, Christopher Lee, um, this was another one that I had never watched before. I'd always knew about it. I have it over here on DVD. I've never watched it, and that was so odd for me. I felt so odd while I was watching this because it's like I love Vincent Price so much, but somehow and Christopher Lee, but I've somehow never watched this one. And Gordon Hessler, who directed this movie, um, you know, I approached this movie with a lot of excitement and optimism going into it, because like I said, I love Vincent Price. I love Christopher Lee. I love Gordon Hessler, because he also directed the film I'm going to be talking about after this one, which I have seen several times. Um, but just the promise of seeing these two, Christopher Lee and Vincent Price, share the screen for the first time in a movie together. Um, Yeah, this was the first time that they'd ever shared a movie together, and I was just also like kind of taken back by that. I was like, why have I never watched this one? I love these guys. This is their first time they've ever did a movie together, so it was just it comes across as irresistible for a fan like myself. But I don't know, but at least now I've watched it now, and now I've experienced it, and and thankfully the film delivered this kind of wonderfully macabre experience that has just I think firmly earned its place in my collection of movies I've watched in this series that I'm doing on YouTube. In, in my DVD series, like I said, I have this movie, but I had never watched it before. But so yeah, I thought this movie was great. It's a little slow. I'm not gonna lie, it's a little slow starting out, but as it goes along, it gets a lot better. And it's weird because when I was watching this, I was thinking to myself, this is like if the Phantom of the Opera were a slasher movie. And if you've seen this movie, you may understand what I mean by that. But the Oblong Box, like I said, it is a kind of this swirling maelstrom of classic Edgar Allan Poe themes, amplified by that Hammer esque, sensibilities that was prevalent, in British horror of the era. It's not a direct adaptation of the short story The Oblong Box by Edgar Allan Poe, but rather this kind of thrilling thing that's been thrown together that borrows, these thematic elements like premature burial and these dark secrets, and blending them with like voodoo rituals and just kind of a that healthy dose of revenge. Um, the film is set in 1865 England, where Sir Edward Markham, who was played by Alistair Williamson, he is horrifically disfigured in this kind of voodoo ceremony for this crime that's actually been committed by his brother Julian, who's played by Vincent Price. And then he is imprisoned by his brother um, because he's guilt ridden, and so Edward, thinking that he can escape his suffering, he enlists this witch doctor and this lawyer to help him fake his death. So betrayal ensues, and it sets the stage for Edward becoming this kind of crimson hooded figure to stalk the countryside on this quest for vengeance. And that's where the whole Phantom of the Opera thing, I felt it had that kind of theme of that was thrown in there. And Vincent Price in this, as always, is just he's simply magnificent. And I love him in this role. He just masterfully embodies that morally ambiguous Julian Markham, who is just this man that is consumed by guilt and secrets, and he's teetering on the edge of madness, basically. Um, and Vincent Price, he imbues just the character with this kind of chillingly, charming facade, hinting at the darkness that lurks beneath the surface. Um, his performance to me in this is just it's a masterclass, in controlled malevolence and just the moments where his sanity unravels are genuinely unsettling. Um, and Christopher Lee, while he's just in a supporting role here as the ethically questionable Dr. Newhart, um, he delivers this kind of typically commanding performance where he brings this quiet intensity to the role. Portraying Newhart as this man driven by ambition and just a willingness to cut corners. Perfectly setting himself up for blackmail and eventually, his bloody demise. Um, though their screen time together is limited, the scenes between Vincent Price and Christopher Lee is still very captivating. And it's subtle, but it's very captivating. So their presence really elevates, I think the film significantly, even if it is just very short period there at the end of the film. But beyond the star power with Vincent Price and Christopher Lee, the supporting cast I think is equally as strong here. Like I said, Alistair Williamson, who plays Edward, despite spending much of the film kind of being hidden behind a mask, um, he manages to convey that kind of simmering rage and desperation of the character Edward. Um, just the visual effects here are kind of relatively restrained for the time. It focuses more on atmosphere and suggestion than just like that outright gore. But I think that's a lot of the reason why I love these types of films is not everything has to be like a gore fest. You know what I mean? Not everything has to be right there up in your face. Uh, Sometimes when it's kind of like restrained like that, um, and it focuses more about around the atmosphere and just kind of like a mystery of like, are they going to reveal something about this character or something about the movie or about the story? I think to me that can be just as appealing as anything else. We're like the people that are obsessed with like these films that have tons of gore and tons of violence and stuff in them. But like I said, I just think that adds to by the way they did this film, it adds to that kind of unsettling nature, of Edward's disfigurement. Even the smaller roles in this too, like the character of Sally, who is this unfortunate maid. It she even her character adds a lot of depth and and texture to the the film's grim landscape, I think. Um, but the Oblong Box, it's not without its flaws. Now the plot can be a bit confusing at times, and the voodoo elements, while it kind of adds a unique flavor, it occasionally feels kind of somewhat awkward. Um, However, these what you would call shortcomings are, I think, easily overshadowed by the film's strengths. The stellar performances here, just that killer atmosphere that the film has, and just that effective blend of Poe-esque horror with more contemporary genre themes. Um, and like I said, the director here, and Gordon Hessler, just the direction from him is very commendable here. Um, he he really creates this kind of palpable sense of dread and atmosphere, just kind of utilizing this like shadowy cinematography and claustrophobic interiors, um, and just suitably, I think, haunting score to really immerse the view. That's a word that I'm I'm using now. Immersing the viewer in the film's dark world. And just the pacing here is deliberate. Allowing the suspense to kind of build gradually. Like I said, it's a little slow at first, but like I said, it builds and builds and builds and builds, and it just really, I'm so glad that it does that because it makes the climax of this film so satisfying. I mean, it's in a grim sort of way. It's very satisfying, and and while the plot may occasionally kind of veer into the convoluted, it ultimately serves as this kind of compelling, framework for the film's exploration of things like guilt and revenge and just, these kind of corrupting power of secrets. Um, and, Gordon Hessler, like I said, he's also the director of the next film we'll be talking about, which is Scream and Scream Again from 1970. And that's a particularly interesting one, and I'm excited to talk about that one because it does also feature all three of these guys here: Vincent Price, Christopher Lee, and Peter Cushing. Um, so yeah, I mean, so Gordon Hessler, he also directed that one. He also directed the Golden Voyage of Sinbad from 1973. Um, but this was the first film starring Vincent Price and Christopher Lee together. And for me personally, I think this is perhaps his most significant and enduring contribution. Just the film provided fans with this opportunity to see these two horror legends together. And even at this time, these guys were horror legends. Even in 1969, these guys were huge. They're legends to this day, of course, to a lot of fans. But just in that time frame that this film was released, these guys were already legends. And I think that says a lot about, who they are and their importance to horror history. Um, and just but like I said, by putting these two together finally in a film together with this film, it just I can't it satisfies me just to because it's something important within the genre community. But I can't imagine how people felt that were fans back when this film was released. So that's always something interesting to think about. But this was also a huge contribution to Gothic horror. Um, the the Oblong Box represents, a solid, if not groundbreaking, entry into the whole Gothic horror subgenre. It it draws upon established themes such as decay and secrets and the macabre, while adding this kind of unique blend of Edgar Allan Poe inspiration and those voodoo elements. And I'll be honest with you, that's one of the things that kind of like took me out of this one, and maybe not have enjoyed it as much as I wanted to, because I'm not really into the voodoo stuff. Um, when it comes to films. And I mentioned that a little bit when I was talking about Dr. Terror's House of Horrors, like the one story segment in that one, which was called Voodoo, and it was about, all this voodoo stuff, um, was just the one that I'm not crazy about. And that was one of the things with this film that just kind of like I think took away from it, in my opinion. But there may be other people out there that feel differently, and that's cool too. But that's just how I feel about it. Um, but over the years, this movie has developed a cult following, amongst fans of classic horror, and I think this is due in part to the presence of Vincent Price and Christopher Lee, but also, to the film's very distinctive atmosphere. It has this very unusual plot and just the exploration of all these dark themes throughout. Um, because the film provides this glimpse into the landscape of British horror cinema, during the late 1960s. And this is a period when studios like American International Pictures and Hammer Films, were producing this very steady stream of gothic, horror movies. And the Oblong Box, definitely reflects, the trends and sensibilities of that era. And for fans of Vincent Price, Christopher Lee, and classic gothic horror, um, the Oblong Box is an absolute must see. It's just this very chilling, delightful film that that delivers this kind of satisfying dose of macabre thrills and showcases and just the it showcases the unparalleled talents of two of horror's greatest icons. So this one I highly recommend. So super cool. I got to watch two movies to start this off that I had never seen before. Love both of them. Highly recommend both of them. But now moving on to the next film. And like I said, this one does feature all three here, Peter Cushing, Christopher Lee, and Vincent Price. And this is another Gordon Hessler film, like I said before. And this is Scream and Scream Again from 1970. So we're going to be diving deep into Scream and Scream Again. Um, and I absolutely love this. May be my favorite film um, when it comes to these guys being together, you know, in a film together. So definitely with all three of them, if I want to pick a film that has all three in the film, it's definitely this one. Um, even if we're just narrowing it down to just Vincent Price and Christopher Lee, um, this still probably be my favorite film that they're in together. Um, and it's a film that, while perhaps not the most conventional vehicle for this beloved, terrifying trio, um, it offers a very truly unique and I think compelling experience for fans of all three of these guys. And let's I'm gonna be upfront with you. If you walked into Scream and Scream Again expecting a typical Hammer style gothic film with with Vincent Price, being Vincent Price as he is in most of his films. He's just this personality that kind of exists within all of his characters. So, and if you're a Vincent Price fan, you get that. But if you're expecting that, you're expecting Lee, Christopher Lee is like his typical like Dracula character, or even Peter Cushing is like a Van Helsing type character. You'll be pleasantly surprised by how different this movie is, and I think that, my friends, is precisely why it's such a fascinating watch. This isn't just another horror film for these guys. This is it's crazy. This is a crazy film. It's just this kind of genre bending fever dream. Which is courtesy of Amicus Productions once again, and directed by Gordon Hessler, who had already worked with Christopher Lee and Vincent Price on the Oblong Box. So imagine this film that starts with body horror, and then pivots to a Cold War spy thriller, then throws in this kind of police procedural, investigating brutal murders. Then add a dash of '60s club culture, and it also features this super powered killer, and, and it all culminates in this kind of chilling sci-fi conspiracy arc. And on paper, I know that sounds extremely messy, and like all over the place. But on screen, under Gordon Hessler's direction and Christopher Wicking's screenplay, I think it becomes this very strangely cohesive, um, you know, very genuinely unsettling ride. Um, just the film unfolds in three of these kind of stories, as I was referring to, and it gradually, begin to weave themselves together as the film goes on. So we start off, we have this poor jogger just, waking up only to discover that his limbs are being amputated without any explanation. And we have this ruthless, seemingly superhuman guy named Conrads in this just in this unnamed totalitarian state, dispatching colleagues with this. He just touches their shoulder. It's like he does like the Vulcan death grip, like Spock did on Star Trek or something. Uh, but then we had the London police who are investigating this series of these gruesome murders that are linked to this mysterious clinic that's run by none other than our own Vincent Price as the character Dr. Browning. So this whole fragmented structure is one of the film's most distinctive features. It keeps you constantly off balance, wondering how all these events can possibly connect, and it builds this kind of sense of unease and paranoia that brings together the entire picture. And I think that's exactly what I love about this movie. It's not a slow burn in the traditional sense. It's more like being dropped off into this kind of chaotic puzzle box and having to piece it together as you go. But I think that's exactly the fun part of the fun in this movie. Um, and while Vincent Price, Peter Cushing, and Christopher Lee while they may not share any kind of extensive screen time together, which is another, I think, cruel twist for for fans of all three of those guys. Their individual contributions are, I think, absolutely delightful to behold in this kind of unusual context of a film. Um, so Vincent Price, as Dr. Browning, he really kind of anchors the London segment of the film. And and as Dr. Browning, he's initially presented as a somewhat, you know, slightly shifty medical professional. Um, it's a more restrained performance for Vincent Price than some of his more well-known and grander roles. Um, but it really makes the eventual reveal in the film all more impactful, I feel. Um, he really brings his kind of signature, um, charisma and that intelligence to the part. Even when the character's true nature is kind of obscure. Um, so seeing Vincent Price, involved in this kind of blend of these police investigations, and then sci-fi and body horror is really a treat for fans, including myself. And he really just he sells the whole scientific detachment and that underlying menace about his character beautifully, I think here. Um, and then we go on to Christopher Lee as the character Fremont. So um, he arrives later in the film as Fremont, which is this kind of high-ranking government official, and Christopher Lee is, I think, perfectly cast in this role. Just kind of bringing that, you know, that very cold authority and just his involvement really immediately elevates the I think the whole political conspiracy angle, which adds all these layers of intrigue and danger, and he brings that intense stare that he always has in films, and that commanding voice to the character of Fremont, just making every moment that he's on screen count. Um, and he feels like he stepped out of like this 70s paranoid thriller, which is exactly, what's needed with this. Um, and I'm realizing now, like everything that I'm talking about this film may seem confusing, and like I said earlier in the review, on paper it is absolutely confusing. By everything I'm talking about, it is absolutely confusing. But I think that's the intriguing part of it all, is that if you've not seen this movie, that was the whole idea, that I want to make it confusing for you guys, so it makes it that more interesting for you guys to want to check out, or not, whichever. Maybe I made a bad decision by laying it out this way. But getting back to the last part of the terrifying trio that's part of this film, Peter Cushing plays the role of Benedict. Now, let me address the elephant in the room, for all you Peter Cushing fans. His role as Major Benedict is very brief. It's essentially just like a cameo. Um, and is it disappointing that we don't get more of Peter Cushing in this? Absolutely. But even in this short scene that he's a part of, he delivers as always. He embodies that very weary, perhaps slightly disillusioned figure, that character perfectly. Just his presence, even for if it's just for a few minutes. I think it just instantly grounds that whole Eastern European segment and reminds you of just the immense talent that he possessed. You can think of it less as a major role and more as this kind of precious fleeting gift. Seeing him appear in this specific film, even for just a few moments, it just I think it's a thrill for all Peter Cushing fans. Um, But just the fact that Vincent Price and Christopher Lee, they share only this brief scene near the end of the film, and Cushing shares none with either, which is indeed, I think, the film's biggest shame from just a purely fan service perspective. Um, but like I said, their individual performances, scattered throughout the story, really provide all these signs of quality and being familiar within the film's, otherwise kind of disorienting landscape. Um, it's a chance to see these masters of macabre, operating in slightly different territory, away from the gothic castles and the period settings. Um, and beyond all those, I wanted to talk about all three of those guys particularly because that's what this whole show is about, and their roles within this film. But um, while those three are the draw for this film, we I think we also got to talk about the supporting cast, particularly Michael Gothard here. As he plays this kind of terrifyingly intense Keith, who is just this super powered killer that's on the loose. His physical performance, the sheer just primal energy that he brings to that role, you know, during everything he's involved in, especially like the chase sequence, which is I think is a highlight of the film, and it's just unforgettable. And just a lot of stuff with him is that character is just genuinely disturbing. Um, and again, Gordon Hessler that directed this, he directs us all with like this kind of kinetic energy, especially during the chase scenes and the more visceral body horror moments. But the film it doesn't shy away from these kind of surprisingly gruesome effects for its time, particularly the amputation and the acid vat scenes. Um, Amicus Productions, often known for their anthologies, they really let loose with something singular and kind of ambitious here. And while this is not, and it's, that reminded me, like, while it's not an anthology film, like this is just a single, story, but it almost feels like an anthology because of all the different segments that are kind of going on all at once that kind of are weaved together towards the end. So I thought that was kind of interesting about this film, especially where it's Amicus Productions that put it out, and they're just mostly known for their anthology films. But Scream and Scream Again, I think might have been overlooked initially when it was released, but it has definitely gained this cult status that is well deserved. Um, I've seen from a lot of people that cite it as one of the better British sci-fi horror films of the era, and I think it's easy to see why. I definitely agree with that. I think it's ahead of its time, and it's kind of fragmented, narrative style, which I it feels like Quentin Tarantino took a lot from like that kind of style for his films later on, like Pulp Fiction. Um, but just there's this with this film, like it it really started that whole trend of that fragmented narrative style. I feel, and just it's that blend of all these genres into one, which is what I find so interesting about it. But the the ending of this film, rather than kind of neatly tying everything up, it more so leaves you with this kind of chilling sense of ongoing conspiracy and dread. With that final line from Christopher Lee that he delivers, "It's only just beginning." So, For fans of Vincent Price, Christopher Lee, Peter Cushing, this film is essential viewing for several reasons. Um, it's a chance to see. Um, it's a chance to see all three of these guys kind of depart from their most famous roles and tackle something modern, complex, and genre bending. And even in limited roles or separate scenes, they all three bring that kind of undeniable presence and talent. That really just elevates the entire production. I feel. And just this isn't a rehashing. This film isn't a rehashing of old themes. It's a genuinely weird, bold, memorable film that really stands out in this kind of you know they're all three of these guys extensive filmographies. I feel. Um, and just knowing that they were all involved in this, even if it's in separate parts, it it just adds that layer of that historical fascination, for fans of these guys. Um, and Scream and Scream Again is is very jarring at times. Often brutal and just it's an undeniably fascinating film that just marries science fiction, horror, political paranoia, just in a way that few others have done. Um, and while we might yearn for more shared screen time from Vincent Price, Christopher Lee, Peter Cushing, just their presence, scattered throughout this kind of labyrinth like plot, um, just really provides essential moments of undeniable class when it comes to these guys. It's a challenging film, um, but for I think dedicated fans out there who appreciate seeing these guys, these masters of macabre, you know, venturing into kind of uncharted, bizarre territory, it is undeniably rewarding and just a deeply positive viewing experience. So if you've never seen Scream and Scream Again, definitely check it out. Embrace the weirdness and just appreciate seeing the great Vincent Price, the imposing Christopher Lee, and just that ever dignified Peter Cushing, contributing to one of British cinema's most intriguing cult oddities that I would call. It's very original, guys. I mean, um, said everything that I may have said in this review for the film may come across as confusing, but that was kind of the point. Because if you've not seen it, I just want to try to intrigue you guys to go out there and watch it. But that brings me to the last film that I'm going to be talking about for tonight, and it kind of came full circle with the whole Amicus anthology stuff that I've been talking about because we started this night off with Doctor Terror's House of Horrors and an anthology film, and now we come to The House That Dripped Blood from 1971, which isn't just another anthology. I feel like this is a vital pit stop on that glorious highway of British horror. And for fans of Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee. So Vincent Price is not in this one, unfortunately, but we still do have Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee. And for films that those two are in together, this one may be my favorite that features both Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing. Um, so let's talk about this film. The House That Dripped Blood from 1971 is just a true gem from Amicus Productions. Um, and like I said, Amicus Productions is slightly more down to earth, and often anthology focused counterpart to Hammer Films. And just for any fan of Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing, this film to me is less a movie, but more of a required viewing. And it's almost like, I would call it an annual viewing, but there are times when I do watch this film more than once a year. So this is probably up there as one of my favorite anthology films of all time. Um, and this is another instance, where Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing, they don't share the screen together, um, but in a way they also do, and I'll get to that in just a little bit. Um, but it's their individual presence again, like it's within these other films I've talked about tonight, is just it's so powerful. You know what I mean? So it's so integral to the distinct flavor of their respective segments that the film feels incomplete, I guess, with that without kind of acknowledging their dual reign here. Um, it's a film that just I think perfectly encapsulates that charm and wit and genuine chills of that early 70s British horror. And it's all kind of just wrapped up in this very neat, unsettling package. Um, so at its heart, The House that Dripped Blood is, like I said, a horror anthology film, which is just a format that Amicus Productions excelled at. And the wraparound story provides the whole connecting uh, part of the story with Inspector Holloway of Scotland Yard arrives to investigate the disappearance of this film star, Paul Henderson. And he visits the local police station where the history of the particular country house that Henderson was renting is recounted through this series of like chilling stories involving its previous tenants, with the like the real estate agent, which is Stoker, is providing these tales. And each tale is this kind of self-contained horror story linked only by the malevolent influence, or perhaps just coincidence, of the house itself. Um, and we start in the beginning. We start with the wraparound story, which the title of the wraparound story is called Framework. Um, and in the first couple parts of the wraparound story, we start with Holloway's arrival, and Sergeant Martin relaying the first two stories that are told in this anthology. Attributing to the bizarre events to the house. And Holloway, who's initially skeptical, becomes our audience surrogate. Just hearing these kind of increasingly unbelievable accounts. Um, and throughout the other parts of the wraparound story, Holloway's kind of skepticism grows after hearing these stories one by one. Particularly when the estate agent that I was talking about, Stoker, he hints at the house's secret, and he learns the details of the third story, then the fourth, you know, uh, which in the fourth story in this film, it involves the very film star that he's been looking for. And Stoker's kind of slightly sinister tone and and willingness to warn tenants adds a layer of kind of dark humor and unease. Um, it's a simple yet brilliant, I think, like framing device that kind of keeps you hooked. Wondering what terrible fate befell the last tenant, and if Holloway will be the next. But let's talk about the story themselves now. So the first story that's told in this film is called "Method for Murder," and it just kicks things off with this kind of fantastic premise that is ripe for psychological horror. Um, and the line between fiction and reality is blurring for a writer, and Denholm Elliott is excellent as Charles Hillier, which is the author whose creation this psychopathic strangler Dominic, um, begins to manifest terrifyingly in his life. And Joanna Dunham is sympathetic as his kind of increasingly worried wife Alice. Um, and just the segment itself expertly plays with the idea of just creative immersion um, gone too far, and the introduction of Robert Lang as the Dr. Andrews adds another layer to this. And just when you think it's a descent into madness, the final revelation, detailed, in it just it's so detailed with it within the story itself is just an absolute like kind of like what the hell. But but the twist involving that, and I don't want to give the twist away in case you've never seen this movie, but it is so classic Amicus Productions. Which it definitely like leaves you like I said, like what the fuck. But it's so good, guys. Like it's this is absolutely fantastic. Like I said, this is one of my top favorite anthology films of all time. And that's just one story. But the next story that's told in this film, this perhaps may be my favorite story in the film. And this it involves Peter Cushing. And Peter Cushing in this one plays Philip Grayson. And the story is called Waxworks, by the way. But like I said, he plays Philip Grayson, who is this kind of retired stockbroker seeking this quiet, but finding only loneliness in the house. And Cushing, is just a master of portraying quiet, haunted characters, and he's absolutely perfect for this role. His performance is, I think understated yet deeply affecting as he drifts through this new life. Finding himself drawn into this to this local wax museum, and his fascination with the Salome figure, which is resembles this dead woman that he loved, is portrayed with this beautiful, uh, almost melancholy like intensity that only Cushing could bring, you know, to the table here. And just the introduction of Joss Ackland as his friend Neville, just adds another layer of shared history and rivalry, you know, um, over the same woman. And just the segment builds this kind of palpable sense of creeping dread. Um, the proprietor here of the wax museum, who's played by Wolf Morris, it just enhances the atmosphere even more. And when we finally learn the horrifying truths behind the waxworks and the fates of our characters here, it's a moment of true macabre beauty. Peter Cushing's ability just to convey terror, and in just the final moments of this segment is just fantastic. Um, this I think this segment alone is just pure gold for any Peter Cushing fan. It's got atmosphere, it's got a tragic edge to it, and a genuinely like killer payoff. Um, and it's one of the biggest reasons why this is one of my favorite anthology films of all time. But then we come to the next story, which is called Sweets to the Sweet, which features Christopher Lee. And this is a segment that allows Christopher Lee to explore a different type of fear, and not the source of it, but he's the victim. So Christopher Lee plays this guy named John Reed, and he's this very stern, seemingly kind of cold widower, raising his young daughter Jane. And initially, he appears cruel, keeping Jane isolated and fearful, especially concerning fire. And Christopher Lee portrays this with his just his typical mannerisms and just making the audience initially suspicious of his motives. So Nairi Dawn Porter is wonderful in this segment as Anne, who's the tutor who tries to reach um, reach out to Jane and kind of like you know just because Jane is very withdrawn and she doesn't want really to fool with anybody. So she's just trying to reach out to Jane, get close to her, and in the midst of all this, she clashes with John. Um, and the little girl, Jane, played by Chloe Franks. I mean, it's such a wonderful job. I mean, it's and to where it feels unsettling, and just her quietness is masking something far more sinister. So as the segment progresses, Christopher Lee. Well, you know what? I'm just going to leave because I don't want to ruin anything about this for anyone that hasn't seen it. But just the performances here in this segment alone is another one of the biggest reasons why this is one of my favorite horror anthology films of all time because Christopher Lee, his performance is commanding as always. The dialogue that he brings to the table, and just everything, just within this segment, watching Christopher Lee, um, either being utterly terrified and helpless at times, is just it's a really disturbing experience. Um, but and I think that this segment alone with Christopher Lee is cemented as a fan favorite for a lot of people that love the House that Drip Blood. Um, but then that brings me to the, the final segment in this film, which is called the Cloak, um, and this one stars John Pertwee. While he's not one of our uh, one of the biggest stars from the film, he is definitely a genre icon in his own right. And his performance here, I think, is absolutely awesome. Um, oh, I left something out. Shit. So I was going to mention during the segment Waxworks. Okay, so as you may have heard me say at the beginning of this review, that Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing are not together in one particular segment in this, but also in a way they are. So what I meant by that was there is a part of the Wax Museum that Peter Cushing's character, uh, frequents throughout that segment, and part of one of the scenes in the background is a wax figure of Christopher Lee as Dracula in the Hammer films. So, so in a way, they were together in this film in a particular scene, but at the same time, no. But I just wanted to add a little tidbit I almost forgot to even mention to you guys. But um, but back to what I was saying about the last segment, though. Um, so, um, like I said, John Pertwee, and he is a genre icon in his own right. But he plays Paul Henderson, which is the guy that Inspector Holloway in the wraparound segments has been looking for. Um, and he's just this kind of temperamental horror actor um, who's just annoyed by the lack of realism in this current vampire film that he's acting in, and he even makes this little kind of jab at Christopher Lee in this, where he says something about he's talking about Dracula films, and he says the one with Bela Lugosi, not this new fella they have, which he's referring to Christopher Lee, who at the time was playing Dracula in the current Dracula at the current Dracula films at that time. Um, but anyway, this character Paul Henderson, his quest for this kind of authentic vampire cloak leads him to this guy named Theo von Hartmann, which is played by what is that guy's name? I, Jeffrey something. I forget his last name, but somebody remembers it. Tell me in the comments. But this whole segment just injects a bit of kind of meta humor and playful horror. Um, and Pertwee is perfect as this kind of pompous but ultimately terrified actor who finds his dedication to realism yielding unexpected and terrifying results. Um, the moment that he discovers that he has no reflection or worse can fly, it is just played with this very great comedic timing. Mixed with genuine horror as well. And also, you got that presence of the gorgeous and iconic Ingrid Pitt as his co-star and his girlfriend Carla. I think that's another huge bonus, for horror fans. Um, and while um, the character of von Hartmann being a vampire that's passing on his curse is like the main point of this segment. Um, the real kicker is just the final twist. And again, I'll leave that out in case people out there have never seen this movie. Um, it's just the whole segment itself is just a brilliant, self-aware type segment, and the ending of it is brilliant. I think it just acknowledges the appeal of on-screen vampires and kind of it gives everyone involved here this kind of chance to shine. And it's a lighter, more fun segment than the previous two told in the film. Um, but I think that's kind of perfect, and it makes the whole charm of anthology films of how that works, um, or what makes it work, I should say. Um, but The House That Dripped Blood was directed by Peter DeFell. Um, and while Peter DeFell is not universally known um, as some of the more contemporaries in the horror genre, DeFell expertly, I think, guides the film here. Maintaining that kind of consistent tone, across all of these stories. And he had more of a this prolific career primarily in television. Directing episodes of many popular British series across various genres, including crime shows and dramas and thrillers. But in terms of feature films, though, The House That Dripped Blood, I think, is arguably his most well known and celebrated contribution. Just cementing his place as this kind of um, I won't say icon, but he really cemented his place in that whole atmospheric twist. You know, twist. What's the word I'm looking for? Shit. So just that these horror movies that have the end with these twists. So I just thought that you know he's really, while he's not as well known as most horror directors out there, he's definitely one that should be celebrated for the House That Dripped Blood alone. And um, this movie also just holds a significant place, I think, in the history of British horror. Particularly within the Amicus Productions. Um, just along with films like Tales from the Crypt and Asylum. Um, I think that this one is considered one of the best. Like I said, it's one of my favorite, but this may be the best anthology film that Amicus Productions has put out, in my opinion. Uh, but and I think there's a lot of other people who would agree with that as well. But just these all these anthology films that Amicus put out just really solidified their identity as these masters of that type of format. Just offering multiple scares for the price of one, and just often featuring a lot of impressive ensemble casts, drawn from all this British acting talent, including Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing. Um, but there's just this movie is so popular amongst horror fans, and it just remains a beloved classic amongst horror fans, particularly those with that affection for British horror of the period. It's just all the various stories and everything, the scares, even the humor in this just ensures that rewatchability for this particular film. Um, and I think most importantly, as the point of this show, is for fans like us, its legacy is just definitely linked to showcasing Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing in roles that while separate, perfectly utilize their unique talents and their screen personas. And Cushing, as always, this intense, um, just you know, just intense intensity that he brings to the table here, and just that tragic father that Lee that Christopher Lee plays in this, and just this kind of uh, or just performance that fans return to again and again. Sorry if I'm kind of like stumbling on my words, guys, because like I'm kind of having difficulty of like trying to think um, what I want to say. So that'll happen from time to time. You'll notice that with me. But anyway, just the film really serves as this kind of almost like a snapshot, of these legends at just the height of their you know of their powers, I guess, outside of their most famous single roles. Just proving that their versatility and that enduring appeal. And I think this movie is a testament to their drawing power. That a film featuring both of them, even separately, immediately earns this kind of place of honor in horror history. But for a fan of Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing, um, the House that Dripped Blood is an absolute must see. Just like all these other films that I've talked about tonight. And the House that Dripped Blood, it delivers exactly what you want: a collection of atmospheric, well-told horror stories, um, two of which feature I think pitch perfect performances from these guys, Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing. And Peter Cushing's segment to me is just a masterclass in conveying that kind that internal suffering. And Christopher Lee is wonderfully just chilling, and just a celebration of his own legend. Just the other stories are strong enough to keep the momentum going until the next icon appears, and the wraparound ties it all together effectively. It's a film that blends psychological horror, classic supernatural scares, a touch of dark humor here and there, and just a lot of undeniable charm. It to me, it's not just a horror film; it's an essential piece of the whole Christopher Lee, Peter Cushing puzzle, proven like their immense value, even when they're not sharing a scene. So definitely seek this one out if you've never seen this before. The House that Dripped Blood, and just let the house's dark history unfold around you. Again, another one, highly recommended. Love it. Definitely, probably will watch it again before this year's over. Um, but this will be the only time that I review it on the 500 movies in 2025, unless my mind changes. We'll see. Um, and so that's it for tonight, guys. Again, I really loved talking about these films, and I'm gonna really enjoy talking about even more films. So, like, while it seemed like Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee were more so um, the focus for this part, trust me, there will be a lot more Vincent Price to talk about in part two. Um, because I will start off part two this Sunday by talking about the Abominable Doctor Fives and Doctor Fives Rises Again. So super excited to talk about those. Is Abominable Doctor Fives is one of my favorite Vincent Price movies of all time. But like I said, that's it for tonight, guys. Got a long day tomorrow. I know me and the family are heading to West Virginia tomorrow to Billy Bob's Wonderland and Hillbilly Hot Dogs and whatever else we can get into. So that's going to be a much needed trip for me just to get some things off of my mind, especially stuff that everything that's occurred this past week. Um, but I just want to thank you guys. I want to thank everyone that for checking out this video. Whether you're watching this live, whether you're watching this on the replay, just really appreciate you guys just coming by and check out me. Bullshit about some movies that that are important to me, not particularly important to anyone else, but just you know. Um, but yeah, just if you've seen any of these movies that I've talked about tonight, just drop me a comment below which one your favorite is of the ones I've talked about. Or, if you have another favorite movie from Christopher Lee or Vincent Price or Peter Cushing that you'd like to talk about, I'd love to hear about that as well. Um, and if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. I'd really appreciate that. And if you're new to the channel, please hit that subscribe button to catch more videos from me like this one, including part two of Masters of Macabre this Sunday night. Just and click that bell for any kind of future notifications. So with all that said, I'm Crater. This is CraterMania. I love you guys. Have a good night.